Hello Total War 3 Kingdoms fans, welcome back to the second video in the Rise of Cao Cao series. This video is going to be mostly about his earliest kind of campaigns as an independent faction and the trials and tribulations he went through there. So the last time we left off, Cao Cao had gone off to strike it out on his own along with his followers and his army, whilst the coalition was disintegrating in the most spectacular fashion possible. So how he ended up getting his start is basically the same way as how a lot of these other eventual warlords would end up getting their starts. Now, because central authority had completely broken down by this point, the traditional governors and protectors of the Han Empire, so to kind of clarify on the terminology, the Han Empire's administrative division was the empire was split into 13 provinces, and each province had a governor and an inspector. I'm going to use the term governor generally just to mean a provincial level leader. And then each province was further split into, anywhere from half a dozen to even more commanderies. Commanderies were basically regions that had, they weren't small at all. They had many cities. They usually covered pretty large swaths of territory. We are, after all, talking about quite a big empire, and the head of a commandery will be called protector. So previously, when I've been using the term governor, I really have just been using it interchangeably to refer to both governors, inspectors, and protectors. So anyway, these governors, as central authority broke down, these governors had to increasingly fend for themselves, and there were many dangers at this time. The first obvious danger was just rival governors, and the second danger was just banditry. Since about 184 AD in China, when they had a huge peasant rebellion called the Yellow Turban Rebellion, a lot of refugees were created, a lot of people were driven off their land, and overall instability has increased. So there was just a lot of banditry, and sometimes these bandit armies were in the sense of tens of thousands or even greater, and could easily overrun townships, commanderies, and even parts of entire provinces. So between these twin threats, as you can imagine, a lot of governors were falling like flies at this point. And because so many of them were falling, the turnover rate was very high, and any local, vaguely government-affiliated leader who could raise an army and protect their land or could drive off enemies ended up being recommended and being appointed as a new governor to replace the old ones. So this is what happened to Cao Cao. He, around 190 and then early 191 AD when he won, actually more around 190. Around 119 AD, where he won a series of victories against a few local bandit armies, he became recommended as the governor of the Yan province. The Yan province is smack bang in the middle of China. It is, in the kind of Yellow River valleys, if you will. Now, at this point, another hugely important thing happened, which is there was a massive army. It's half an army and half just a mass migration, and these were refugees and rebels from the Qing province, which is in eastern China. Now, these were the remnants of a massive rebellion called the Yellow Turbans, as I mentioned. So the actual rebellion happened about 6 years before this, and it was crushed, but the people were really never dealt with. And this mass migration / army comprised of 300,000 people. Cao Cao won a series of devastating victories against them, despite only having a few thousand men under him. And what he ended up doing, rather than driving them off, was that he settled these refugees upon his land and then incorporated their ranks into his own, and kind of won their loyalty by giving them land and giving them food and providing for them. And these men ended up becoming essentially his first core grade army. They were called the Qingzhou Army Corps. Now, the Qingzhou Army Corps, out of this massive 300,000, he ended up eventually kind of taking 30,000 as basically the backbone of his army. So it, within the space of a few months, elevated him from one of many hundreds of these kind of governors into one of the key players in the North China Plains. And so after that, he had the Yan province, and he also had an army of 30,000 all of a sudden. And if you look at the geographical breakdown of this kind of, after the dust had settled from that initial wave of clashes between the former members of the alliance, you can see Cao Cao there in the Yan province, kind of in the center of northern China. At the same place was his close friend Zhang Miao, who had become the protector of Chenliu, which is a key commandery within the Yan province. So he technically was, I guess, a subordinate to Cao Cao, but it's more accurate to describe him as an ally. To the west, over the ruins of the old capital Chang'an, the remnants of Dong Zhuo's forces, which is mainly Guo Si and Li Jue, they had begun fighting among themselves, but because at this point Dong Zhuo was gone and the coalition was abandoned and they were beyond all these mountain passes, people didn't really care about them so much. To the north of them, in the North China Plains, was Yuan Shao and Gong Sun Zan. Yuan Shao held at this point the Ji province, and Gong Sun Zan held the further north You province, which is around where modern day Beijing is. And then to the south, Yuan Shu was definitely the biggest player in the south. He held a lot of southeastern China. And then to the kind of like further middle south was Liu Biao, who is a close ally of Yuan Shao, sorry. And he's actually a member of the imperial clan, and he held the Jing province, which is quite massive. Sorry if you don't get all of these straight away. I'm sure by the end of these videos I'll have mentioned them enough that they'll come as second nature to you. So the key, so one other kind of minor governor slash warlord I want to pay attention to is Tao Tian. Tao Tian held the Shu province, which is the province right next to the Yan province, and was basically the logical path of expansion for Cao Cao if he wanted to gain more land. And Tao Tian was not, he was quite a mediocre man. He was, not one of these new upstarts that arose. He kind of just like held this province that's kind of been at peace for a long time, and he's gathering his own strength, but he's not really, it was never seen, it never appeared like that he had held great ambitions besides guarding his own corner of the empire. So in addition to kind of the land he held, it was at this point that Cao Cao's kind of core of officers and strategists would begin to take shape. So we're going to go over this, I guess, in some detail, so bear with me here. So you had Cao Cao kind of as the head of this emerging faction. You had Zhang Miao, as I mentioned, who was a key ally who held parts of the same province that he did. And then you had his chief strategist is a man named Xun Yu, and Xun Yu is possibly the most important person in this faction following Cao Cao himself. Xun Yu, he was really like a conciliaire. He joined Cao Cao because he admired Cao Cao's kind of like idealism and ideology. Xun Yu himself is a very traditional Han Empire loyalist and Confucian. He's from a gentry family, and what he did for Cao Cao was that he made this like emerging warlord state more than just an army with some land. He implemented a lot of like civil administration. He would usually hold the home base whenever Cao Cao was away on campaigns, and he would also advise him on basically any matter from strategy to diplomacy to military. And something else important he did is that he helped build a civilian advisor corps to Cao Cao. So the advisors, he was really, basically he wasn't in charge of the advisors, but he was definitely first among equal. So at this point, some of the key advisors included Cheng Yu, who was another very, very key advisor. Guo Jia, who was Xun Yu's best friend and kind of like known as this genius savant character, who was also very close with Cao Cao. Guo Jia will come much more into prominence later. And then Chen Gong, who was another key kind of strategist slash civil advisor. Now, in terms of the generals that Cao Cao had under him at this point, he had his two cousins Cao Ren and Cao Hong. Cao Hong, you may remember, saved Cao Cao's life during the disaster at Xingyang. He had Xiahou Dun and Xiahou Yuan, who were kind of a pair of brothers. The Xiahou family ended up being one of the most key supporters of Cao Cao during his rise to power. And they would both become kind of famous generals as time went on. And he also had other generals included Yu Jin, who again doesn't play a huge role at this point, but you know, he does become a very, very prominent general later on. Li Dian, who is known as this kind of like very sage, wise, scholarly general, and Yue Jin, who is known as a fantastic kind of cavalry commander and vanguard later on. And in addition to kind of these generals, it's also important to call out some of the larger-to-life kind of almost champion-like figures that Cao Cao had around him. So I'm going to group these loosely under captains. Xu Chu is probably the most important of these men. This man was apparently a beast of a man, a ferocious warrior, and a great captain. He was almost something like Cao Cao's personal bodyguard. He led a unit called the Tiger Guard Cavalry. And then there was Dian Wei, who another beast of a man. He literally was just Cao Cao's bodyguard, and also, you know, like kind of led his personal guards. A lot of his personal security was entrusted to Dian Wei. And then lastly, another figure was Cao Chun, who is, I believe he is the younger brother of Cao Ren, and so that makes him also a cousin to Cao Cao. And he was known as a kind of a good cavalry commander and vanguard as well, and he led a fearsome unit called the Leopard Cavalry Guard. So with, you know, such a kind of impressive collection of heroes under him and men of talent, and also holding, you know, one of the kind of 13 provinces of the empire, things were going pretty well for Cao Cao. He also, you know, obviously had the Qingzhou Army Corps, a huge army. So all that would take was some kind of powdered keg to set this all off. The event which would ultimately set off this powder keg was in 193 AD. Cao Cao's father was traveling through the Shu province under the protection of the governor of the Shu province, TUNTIAN. He was traveling, you know, without a guard. It was just on some personal business. He was traveling with his kind of family, attendants, and his kind of a baggage train. And at this point, tragedy befell in that several of TUNTIAN's officers led armed men, and they ambushed and slaughtered the entire carriage to a man, killing Cao Cao's father. TUNTIAN immediately apologized to Cao Cao and promised that the men who had killed Cao Cao's father had nothing to do with him, and that they were mutineers. However, this was not enough for Cao Cao, and he would begin a campaign of bloody vengeance. Some might say that this was also a cynical move because, as I said before, TUNTIAN held the Shu province, a relatively lightly defended province, which was the most logical point of expansion for Cao Cao. So it's impossible to say how much, how much genuineness went into this campaign of vengeance, but within the context of the society of that time, Cao Cao raising an army to invade the Shu province was absolutely, within the realm of expectations. This is a traditional Confucian society. Loyalty and honor and duty to your father was a very important tenet to the society, and so even though the campaign he waged was incredibly bloody, full of massacres and razings of towns and collective punishment, from the point of view of a lot of the people at the time, this was nothing wrong. He was merely avenging his father. So nonetheless, in 193 AD, Cao Cao set off to invade TUNTIAN's Shu province. He had left Zhang Miao in the commandery of Chenliu, and you could tell that Zhang Miao was such a trusted friend and ally of his, because Cao Cao gave instructions to his own family that if he was to die on this campaign, his own family should go to Zhang Miao for protection. So the two men were very close, and it seemed like Cao Cao had no problems leaving him behind. The invasion initially went very, very well for Cao Cao. TUNTIAN was basically unable to stand up to the assault of Cao Cao's army at all, which is not surprising given the kind of amount of officers and men that Cao Cao had. So TUNTIAN began to retreat deeper into Shu province territory. It's not known the exact path of the campaign, however it is known that during this period, Cao Cao took about 5 to 10 separate walled cities. In addition to leaving Zhang Miao behind, he had also left 2 other men behind. So the vast majority of his officers and his troops were away with him on campaign, but he had left Xun Yu behind to guard the eastern portions of the Yan province. Xun Yu, as I mentioned earlier, was Cao Cao's chief strategist, and he had left a bunch of officers, including Chen Gong, behind in Xuchang, which was the capital of the Yan province, and acted kind of as his grand home base. So as this war was continuing and Cao Cao seemed like he could not be stopped, Cao Tian withdrew deeper into Shu province territory and called upon anybody who would be willing to aid him. Now, needless to say, not many people were willing to aid him. For one, Cao Cao had a huge and fearsome army. For two, a lot of people felt like Cao Cao was justified in invading the Shu province, because after all, his father had died. And last of all, Cao Cao there was also not much to be politically gained with helping Cao Tian. He wasn't a politically powerful man. He had even aligned with Dongzhuo at one point in a kind of a non-aggression pact during the coalition against Dongzhuo. So there wasn't a lot of goodwill to Cao Tian by kind of like the other powerful warlords at this time, which is namely Yuan Shao and Yuan Shu, and especially Yuan Shao, who is kind of nominally at least friendly with Cao Cao. The only one man who responded was a man called Liu Bei. Now, if you know anything about Three Kingdoms at all, you know that Liu Bei is one of the progenitors of the Three Kingdoms, equal to Cao Cao and Sun Jian, and this is the start of his story. Liu Bei at that point had been serving under the governor of the Qing province, kind of to the northeast of China. This is where the core of Cao Cao's armies came from. He didn't have a lot of men, especially not to oppose Cao Cao's elite army of 30,000, but he did have, I believe it was several thousand kind of barbarian cavalry, and he raised about another few thousand fresh peasant levies. He ended up with cobbling together an army of 10,000 and went south to aid Cao Tian, even as Cao Tian kept retreating and even as Cao Cao kept advancing. Liu Bei knew that he would be unable to beat Cao Cao in a head-on engagement, so he and Cao Tian devised a plan where Liu Bei would keep going south, almost to the southern edges of the Shu province, and open up a second front against Cao Cao, whilst Cao Cao was advancing in more of a direct easterly direction. And at this time, Cao Cao kept taking towns and, kept up his bloody path of revenge. Eventually, Cao Cao took quite a key city, and on his way back to resupply, this was the time when Liu Bei thought that he should spring his ambush. And spring his ambush he did, and he dutifully faced Cao Cao and lost. It was not even close. The history books, Liu Bei's own biography, if I remember correctly, doesn't even mention this battle. So, and Cao Cao's biography mentions it in a very dismissive way, as in, Liu Bei ambushed our Lord and our Lord beat him. So all things seemed to be going pretty well for Cao Cao. Nobody seemed to be able to stop him, but it was at this point that the campaign took a very dark and very devastating turn. At this point, Cao Cao suffered his great betrayal. So as I've said earlier, Cao Cao left the kind of defense of the Yan province, his home base, to 3 key figures. There was Zhang Miao, his close friend and relative, there was Xun Yu, his lord strategist, and there were the officers in Xuchang, among whom Chen Gong was relatively a senior member. Chen Gong had defected, and what's more, Chen Gong had invited Lu Bu, the god of war and the man responsible for killing Dongzhuo, into the Yan province. Lu Bu at this point had been operating as a mercenary general with several thousand men, but the point is that the men serving under him were very battle-hardened, and Lu Bu was also a tried and proven commander. Lu Bu entered Yan province whilst the majority of Cao Cao's troops were away, and there was nobody really to oppose him. And what's worse, Chen Gong not only led the officers in Xuchang in a mutiny and captured that city, whilst Lu Bu was rampaging around the countryside, he eventually convinced Zhang Miao that Zhang Miao should also turn on Cao Cao. One of the key reasons this happened is because Zhang Miao's younger brother was part of the mutiny, and Chen Gong convinced Zhang Miao that should Cao Cao return, Zhang Miao would not get off scot-free. So at this point, the majority of the Yan province had turned, and only Xun Yu in the eastern reaches of the Yan province still held camp for the loyalists. Xun Yu acted very quickly as well. he looked at the map and essentially realized who was turning against Cao Cao, and he surmised that he would be able to hold the province if he acted very quickly. So he immediately dispatched the other advisor, Cheng Yu, to another county further south, and basically told Cheng Yu that the 3 counties in the southeastern corner of the Yan province needed to be held at all costs. And Cheng Yu acted very quickly. He essentially got to, the story is that he got to his first town and saw the envoy from the opposing side, from the mutineers, also petitioning the governor, and without a second thought he just killed the envoy on the spot and almost forced the kind of mayor of the town to swear his loyalty. So whilst Xu Yu and Cheng Yu were holding a desperate rearguard against the rampaging armies, Cao Cao finally got news and began to turn back. And it was during this retreat that his troops committed many of their worst massacres. So I want to make it clear, as much as I'm a Cao Cao fan, there were several incidents in his career which were completely morally indefensible, even for that time, and this was one of them. Even the pro-Cao Cao biographers later, would describe the situation with that familiar phrase, and that is, the number of dead was beyond counting. So as Cao Cao returned, Lü Bu was attacking a key town named Puyang, and it was at this point that Cao Cao decided to confront Lü Bu. So we would get the first of the clashes between the so-called hero of chaos and the so-called god of war. Cao Cao basically came upon the town of Puyang, where Lü Bu was stationed with several thousand, or anywhere up to 10,000 troops, and Cao Cao, despite having a forced march back, essentially launched straight into attack because he understood that speed was the key. And what the history books recorded was that this did not go Cao Cao's way. In battle, Lü Bu used his cavalry in the first clash of arms, charging against the Qingzhou army. The Qingzhou army fled in terror, and the formations of Cao Cao were in complete disarray. Fleeing from a great fire, Cao Cao fell from his horse, suffering burns on his left palm. He was supported onto a horse and then led his soldiers in retreat. Before reaching the camp, the army halted. Most of the officers had not sighted Cao Cao for some time, and feared he was dead. Cao Cao then strained himself to rouse his officers, ordering that siege weapons be prepared immediately so that Lü Bu could be besieged once again. And this is from the Book of Wei. So as you can tell, this first engagement does not go well for Cao Cao, but nonetheless, you could see once again that sheer force of will, putting himself in danger and then just straining to hold command. Whenever I read this, I'm always kind of reminded of the way that Caesar fought. He wasn't in the melee, but he was definitely up there. Across the next 100 days, Cao Cao and his and the few counties that still supported him would wage an endless war against basically Lü Bu and all of his allies. And the situation at this time, from all records, grew very desperate because Cao Cao had lost his home base whilst campaigning, which means that he essentially did not have a line of supply anymore. And furthermore, the province was so ravaged by kind of constant fighting that the other side, Lü Bu's side, also did not have a supply anymore. Because as I said, Lü Bu does not have a home base. He's a wandering mercenary general. So what we have recorded is this. The Cao army and Lü Bu faced each other for more than 100 days. At that time, there was a plague of locusts, and the commoners were extremely hungry. Subsequently, Yuan Shao sent a man to convince Cao Cao to retreat and join him. Because he had just lost the Yan province, and his army was fresh out of grain, he was inclined to agree. Cheng Yu argued against such a surrender, and Cao Cao heeded his advice. In that year, 1 hu of millet cost more than 500,000 cash. There appeared the phenomenon of cannibalism. Cao Cao was forced to dismiss his newly recruited soldiers and officials, again from the Book of Wei. So you can see this was really getting desperate. Not only was everybody starving, not only were the civilians and the general population starving, there wasn't even enough food for Cao Cao to kind of keep his army going. He had to start dismissing portions of his troops. So Cao Cao at this point realized that he needed to force a confrontation. He was so close to defeat that he was considering Yuan Shao's offer to just come serve him, which would have been the end of Cao Cao as an independent faction. And here we see another kind of motif, which is kind of Cao Cao's followers' belief in him. So, we had Cheng Yu, his advisor, basically saying, no, do not surrender. And this would happen again and again, and it was really like the loyalty and belief of a lot of Cao Cao's men. They often seem to believe in him more than he believed in himself. So that is definitely kind of a trait of his character, that he inspired such loyalty. So Cao Cao needed to force a showdown soon, because he was running out of food. But what he kind of, I mean, he probably did realize it, but what we, didn't get a sense of from the history was the fact that Lü Bu was also out of food. So both sides were fighting quite desperately. Cao Cao was doing anything he could to get food, and the final showdown would happen almost on accident at a town called DONGMIN, where Cao Cao led his elite troops there in order to gather the harvest. So upon hearing that Cao Cao led his troops there, Lü Bu would also lead his, Lü Bu and Chen Gong led an army of 10,000 to try to chase after Cao Cao. Cao Cao arrived at DONGMIN, set up camp, and immediately told his troops to go to the countryside and start gathering grain. And he left his camp very lightly defended when Lü Bu and Chen Gong arrived with 10,000 men, far more than he had. At this point, Cao Cao showed another one of his key traits, which is a sense of just great battlefield bravado and kind of on-the-fly battlefield tactics. So at this point, Cao Cao moved very quickly. He ordered the camp attendants and the camp followers, because as you know, during this time, all armies were basically followed by this mass of civilians. We're talking about craftsmen, artisan, a lot of women, a lot of family, etc. This was not an entirely professional affair. So Cao Cao ordered the camp attendants, most of whom were women, to arm themselves and guard the walls of the camp and place themselves very visibly within sight of Lü Bu's army. Lü Bu and Chen Gong, when they approached with 10,000 elite, cavalry, and they saw the sight of the walls being guarded by women with swords, they immediately grew suspicious. They believed that this was a trap, that if they charge into the camp, Cao Cao's elite troops will surely spring up and massacre them. So Cao Cao essentially bluffed them. And whilst they were hesitating upon deciding, it just happened that Cao Cao's elite troops had returned from their harvest, at least portions of them had. And they engaged upon this great battle, and Lü Bu and Chen Gong were ultimately beaten off. They weren't beaten badly, but they were beaten off, and Cao Cao basically recovered from, within an inch of his life. And as I said before, although Cao Cao's faction was desperately short of food, so was Lü Bu's faction, and even though they still maintained an army, after this they could no longer fight on. So they all made the decision to flee east to TUNTIAN and Liu Bei's kind of protection. And during this time as well, TUNTIAN had passed away, and he, as a token of gratitude and probably to protect the people of the Shu province, he left Liu Bei in charge, despite the fact that Liu Bei was this kind of guest general. So Chen Gong and Lü Bu would flee very quickly. Zhang Miao would also try to flee, but Cao Cao's vengeance got to him. I guess it would be improbable for Cao Cao to kind of forgive a betrayal of such magnitude. Cao Cao not only had Zhang Miao killed, he also had Zhang Miao's entire family killed. And at this point, Cao Cao might have gone after Lü Bu and Chen Gong, but the truth was that he was just too weak to invade the Shu province again. So he understood that he had to rebuild. And it was really in this rebuilding that we see the transformation of Cao Cao from kind of a talented, willful, but very tumultuous general into the future great man of China. The year is now 195 AD. Cao Cao had been fighting and governing and being close to beaten for about 5 years now as the governor of the Yan province. And in these 5 years, although he had a fairly large army and a very effective officer corps, he was really in no better position than he started. He was still surrounded by enemies. He still had this, problem where every time he would go off, he would expose his home base to a vast amount of dangers. And it was during this period that he began to implement 3 sets of policies, which when put together, elevated him above any of the other warlord states and kind of made him into a proto-state onto himself. The first of these policies was the TUNTIAN system. The TUNTIAN system was something that he came up with in order to ensure constant food supply and ensure that his armies could fight further, could fight longer, and could also just remain more organized. And it's one of those things where when all the elements are explained to you, it seems so simple and it seems so brilliant, and you wonder why it's never been done before. In a sense, it has been done before. The Tuntian system originated kind of in the early Han Dynasty, and it was used to support long campaigns during the border. This was how the Han Empire was able to support, vast campaigns that lasted for, decades at a time. I mean, at the height, the Han Empire's influence reached into modern-day Afghanistan and Mongolia and Vietnam. So it was a way for troops to organize and feed themselves. But what Cao Cao did was that he fine-tweaked it and he applied it to the situation of the time. And what was the situation of the time? As I said, nobody had enough food. Farmers didn't have enough food because they were constantly, being driven off by wars and bandit raids. So there was a large amount of refugees and a large amount of bandits. And furthermore, because people kept being driven off, and because there were these constant skirmishes and nowhere was really safe, it also meant that most of the land stayed unused, and the refugees didn't really have any infrastructure to kind of start forming maybe their own villages and starting to get farming back up again. So what Cao Cao invented was this. It was basically a three-sided deal. Firstly, Cao Cao owns a lot of land, and a lot of this land is unused because there was simply nobody around to farm it. So what he did was that he parceled out all of these unused lands to various refugees and bandits. If you were a bandit, he would give you, amnesty and say, come to me, farm this land. And second of all, in addition to distributing all of this land, he would also rent out equipment. Because, as I said, most of these refugees and most of these bandits and kind of mass migrants didn't have the infrastructure needed to get a farm started. And lastly, he would organize all of these refugees into colonies and settle them upon the new lands, into kind of like these vast agricultural colonies that also acted as units that trained perhaps in self-defense, or perhaps, just as soldiers in their off time. Now, on the side of the refugees and bandits, they would farm the land to feed themselves, but obviously, such a highly organized kind of colony system would create surplus grain. So the surplus grain would end up going to Cao Cao. So in a sense, the surplus grain, Cao Cao was actually losing out nothing from this deal. The land was being unused anyway. Equipment is, at the end of the day, not that expensive to produce. And banditry was also always a huge problem. So he suddenly gained a huge population base, which would farm for him and give his surplus grain. And these refugees were happy to do it because, and this is where the third part of the element comes in, the army would protect these colonies. And in addition to just the army protecting these colonies, they was also draw recruits from these refugees. So a lot of these people, a lot of these refugees, farmers would end up joining the army. And their unit cohesion would be increased because the units were drafted from the same colonies. So yeah, it was really this three-sided deal where Cao Cao gave out land and rented out equipment. The refugees settled on the land and provided surplus grain and also provided a source of recruits. And the army protected this land and drew and trained recruits from these refugees. And they would also assist in kind of harvest during off time because the army was just stationed around the province. Now this was a brilliant system, and it basically gave him an ability to organize a much larger army, and his army would become professional much more quickly because the people that you were farming with was essentially the people that you were training with during off time. As most of you know, subsistence farming is not really a full-time role. There's heavy times and there's, times when the like harvest and planting, and then there's the rest of the time when you don't actually have that many things that absolutely need to be done. So the first of his reforms was the Tuntian system, and this gave him food, this gave him population, and this also gave him, the basis of an effective army. The second policy came about more by chance. If you take yourself back to, maybe about 10 slides ago, I was talking about how Dongzhuo's remnant generals, Guo Si and Li Jue, was fighting over the ruins of the old capital, Chang'an. Well, many people forgot that the boy emperor, Emperor Xian, was also in these ruins, and at a certain point he could not bear this situation anymore. He was being used as a bargaining chip between these two generals. So he gathered up a group of his loyalists, and they basically charged out and headed back east towards Luoyang, towards the old capital that Dongzhuo had burned to the ground. And the court essentially became in exile. I mean, they had a few supporters, but they were not really powerful enough. And they headed to Luoyang, and this, it sounded like a very desperate situation. They were harassed the entire time by minor warlords and governors and bandits. They were very short on food, and when they arrived in Luoyang, they realized this city is indefensible because it had been burned to the ground, and there's also no food around. We have some truly heartbreaking tales of even very senior ministers and members of the imperial family being forced to subsist on bark in the wilderness because that's how little food they had. So at this time, obviously, word got out to all the key warlords in the eastern provinces, and it was expected that one of them would come to the emperor's rescue and come and protect Luoyang. The prime candidate was essentially Yuan Shao, because he is the scion of the most illustrious family. He led the coalition that was, in theory meant to rescue the emperor, and he was also a Confucian traditionalist, so all eyes were on Yuan Shao. And Yuan Shao's camp debated this for a long time, and essentially they made an eminently foolish decision to not rescue the emperor. Basically it seemed like because of selfishness. It seemed like they were kind of petty and just didn't think big enough. Yuan Shao's advisors basically came up with the idea that if the emperor was with Yuan Shao, then Yuan Shao would no longer be an independent faction, and he would have to serve the emperor, and this would create too much, kind of imperial red tape. It would distort the chain of command. So the emperor languished in Luoyang for a few more months, and it was at this point that Cao Cao heard about this, and he straight away was interested in rescuing the emperor. We're not sure if it's because of idealism or because, as I said, Cao Cao in his youth was a firebrand ideologue, or if it was because of a matter of pragmatism that he would see what a huge advantage this would give him. Most of his advisors, especially ones like Xun Yu and Cheng Yu, who, as I said, were also kind of young ideologues, agreed with him that he should definitely rescue the emperor. So he sent his cousin Cao Hong again with an army to rescue the court that was being besieged by these petty bandits and invite them back to Xuchang, Cao Cao's home base. Now, this had far-reaching implications, much further than anybody could have realized at the time, because what Cao Cao had done with this one fell swoop was essentially make himself into the central government. Because he was protecting the emperor, he was also really controlling the emperor, and he had the power to make imperial decrees. He promptly named himself Chancellor of the Han Empire, and in order to not offend Yuan Shao, who's the one faction that is properly vastly more powerful than him, and Yuan Shao was also more senior than him, he gave Yuan Shao the rank of the Grand Commandant, which is the only rank that is higher than the Chancellor. And this kind of sated Yuan Shao, although really Cao Cao knew the game he was playing. He knew that power now rested with him because two reasons. First of all, by holding the emperor, he made himself into the central government, and he could dole out political favors and also political punishments to all the regional governors, with much more kind of a air of officialness. And the name he had for this policy was suppress the rebellious in the name of the emperor. This means that if you were the enemy of Cao Cao, suddenly you became not just the enemy of Cao Cao, but the enemy of state as a whole. Your positions could be stripped. And secondly, if you were the ally of Cao Cao, he could reward you with positions and fiefdoms and all manners of good things. And the other kind of important side effect of this is that by positioning himself as the central government, he had made himself into the natural target for any young ideologue across the empire who wanted to come serve the emperor. Men such as Xun Yu, for example, they would all naturally flock to him because from then on, Cao Cao as the central government became analogous with the Han Empire. And if you wanted to help the Han Empire, if you're a young, red-blooded, patriotic man who saw the empire falling apart and you want to restore things to order and glory, you go to Xuchang and you enter the service of Cao Cao. So with all of these new talents coming in, Cao Cao, it was here that he came up with the third plank of his policy. And the third plank of his policy can be summarized as a phrase called employ on merit alone. So one thing to understand is that, you know, this seems very obvious. Obviously, you want the more meritorious person to get the position and to be employed. But actually, this wasn't so obvious when you're talking about 2,000 years ago in Imperial China. This was not what you would call a meritocratic society. The traditional Confucian worldview is that you should employ on virtue, not merit. That a man who was capable is not as ideal for government as a man who was virtuous. But Cao Cao's argument is essentially that virtue has its uses, but in times of war, in times of chaos, when the empire and the people really need somebody to step up, you can't just live on good intentions. You have to be able to do it, whether you are a scholar, whether you are a general, or whether you're an administrator. Merit was what counted. So not only did a huge amount of men at this point flock to Cao Cao, they were also the ones that Cao Cao thought could be useful were also highly valued. So Cao Cao's camp at this point grew massively. Some of the key kind of figures who entered Cao Cao's camp at this point, just going back to the old organization chart, we have Xun You, who is Xun Yu's younger cousin, who would become another key strategist. We had Yang Xiu, who was a famous scholar and a very famous wit, who would also enter into Cao Cao's service. Another man who entered into Cao Cao's service was a man named Kong Rong, who was a former governor on the northeast, kind of near the Liaodong Peninsula of China. Now, Kong Rong was an interesting case, and he represented one of many of people in this situation. Kong Rong did not like Cao Cao. Kong Rong wanted to serve the emperor. He was known as a great Confucian scholar and as an incredibly virtuous and illustrious man. Actually, his surname might give you some insight into that. He's descended from Confucius. That is why his surname is Kong. So him entering into your ploy lends a degree of prestige and legitimacy into your government. And even though Kong Rong hated Cao Cao and kind of acted as an opposition in court along with other people, it just shows the brilliance of Cao Cao making himself into the central government, because it just looked good on every front. He could say, look, even this great virtuous man who hates me, I have room for him, because I'm not about just me, I'm about the empire as a whole. And second of all, even men who were a bit reluctant about serving him, such as Kong Rong, he could say to them, look, it's bigger than me, it's about the empire, come serve the empire is in crisis, the emperor is with me. So yeah, Kong Rong himself, not hugely important, but I do want to illustrate him because of an interesting aspect he lent to Cao Cao's regime. Another advisor that could use calling out here is an advisor named Man Chong. Now, Man Chong was kind of a general as well as an advisor, but I want to call him out not because he's hugely important, but because he was responsible alongside Cao Cao for designing a lot of the finer details of the TUNTIAN system. So we have him to thank essentially for Cao Cao's faction becoming essentially a functioning state. In terms of generals, Cao Cao at this point made one great gain, and that was the general Xu Huang. Xu Huang was a loyalist of the emperor who, when his master was defeated by Cao Cao, he joined Cao Cao very readily. He would eventually go on to become one of Cao Cao's absolute top 5 generals. And again, this happened because Cao Cao made himself into the central government. So that's where we have it at Cao Cao at around 195 AD. Suddenly he went from within the space of 5 years, he went from a run-of-the-mill warlord to somebody who held an entire province, one of the 13 provinces of the empire. He had an army, a very large army that was cohesive because of his agricultural policies. This army was numbered around 300,000 men. He had the authority of the central government. He literally controlled the emperor, and men of talent were flocking all around him. He was still surrounded by enemies at every side, just like he was 5 years ago, but this time, when he marched out, it would be different. So that concludes part 2 of our 5-part Rise of Cao Cao series. And in the next episode, we're really going to go into Cao Cao's rise. he starts displaying basically all of his brilliance. It's not going to be an easy path. It's going to be a very dramatic path with a lot of, you know, heartaches and setbacks. But it's, you know, in these next few parts that he really begins to shine. Okay, thanks all. Hope once again this was educational. Sorry, I do realize that the sound has some issues. I'm still trying to work that out. As you may have guessed, I'm an incredible novice at making videos. Please like and subscribe, y'all, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.